Behavioral interviews are the place where you are going to get the roles that matter the most, the leadership roles, the roles with the most compensation. So especially if you're applying for a FANG job, the difference between level X and level X plus one, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. So if you are coming into this behavioral interview, which is one of the really key pieces that these companies look at when they start to assess you for level and they start to decide what level to hire you at, if you perform well in this behavioral interview, you are looking at a potential multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of total compensation per year that you could be securing.
Hi, Austen. We're here to talk about your new book. So let's dig into it, and let's kick off with why are behavioral interviews so important?
Thanks, John. It's awesome to be here and really excited to talk about the book and about behavioral interviews. So the reality, and we all know this, is that AI is eating implementation work. So when anybody can generate code just by giving instructions to a computer, then what's going to happen is that all those other things that we do in our jobs, all the soft skills, all the people interactions, all the ownership, all the leadership pieces, those become the differentiators between candidates. And so if you're in a job process right now, especially in this super highly competitive job market right now, a lot of layoffs, a lot of people applying for the same job, companies are going to be looking at this behavioral interview as a way to differentiate between candidates.
So, and how much of an impact is that going to have on the kind of offer you get if you get through the interview and get to an offer?
Yeah, for sure. Behavioral interviews are the place where you are going to get the roles that matter the most, the leadership roles, the roles with the most compensation. So especially if you're applying for a FANG job, the difference between level X and level X plus one could be hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. So if you are coming into this behavioral interview, which is one of the really key pieces that these companies look at when they start to assess you for level and they start to decide what level to hire you at, if you perform well in this behavioral interview, you are looking at a potential, multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of total compensation per year that you could be securing. Plus more responsibility, more exciting problems, getting to meet with more leaders, right? All the things that come with having a higher level at a company. This behavioral interview is the place where people are going to be assessing you for that ability.
So would it be fair to say that then this is the most important interview? You've got to pass the rest, but this is what's going to determine where you are and how well you get paid for it?
Really good question. I think it depends on what level you're applying for. So if you're a more junior candidate, maybe you're a couple of years out of school, I think that the technical interviews are going to be number one, and then behavioral is going to be number two. And I think if you are a more senior candidate, if you are somebody who is coming in at, say, a senior engineer or a staff engineer or principal engineer, certainly if you are a manager, the behavioral interviews are the most important ones.
And when you go into that interview, what are the interviewers looking for? What's really the focus that they're trying to get to?
Yeah, so interviewers everywhere are forecasters. They are people asking, how is this candidate going to perform once they get into my organization, right? Will they be successful? And behavioral interviewers in particular are using two different evaluation systems, and that they're sort of looking at simultaneously when they are talking to you and evaluating you as a candidate. They're using some kind of structured framework, so they have identified things, aspects of engineers inside of their company which have made them successful. So things like ownership and ambiguity and conflict resolution, things like perseverance and growth and communication, all those sort of lists of, we call them signal areas. They've identified those in advance, and they say, if someone has these aspects, they'll be successful in my company. They've also identified probably something specific to their company. So Amazon has 16 leadership principles. A lot of companies have company values that they've identified. And so if they find candidates that embody those values, they know they're going to be successful. So that's number one. They've structured some list of things that they're really looking for. And if you as a candidate don't know what the other person is looking for, the interviewer is looking for, it's hard to give them that. So that's really important for you as a candidate to understand what is that structured layer that the interviewers are looking at. The other thing that interviewers are looking at, and I call it the intuitive layer, this is a kind of pattern matching, a cultural aspect of the interviewer is looking to see, do you fit in a sense, right? Do you have the qualities and aspects? Do you have the approach to problems? Do you have the right attitude, right? Have you solved the kinds of problems that we have solved in the past? And so that's more of a cultural layer that they put on top of it. It's sometimes hard to describe. They may not even have that as in their conscious mind that they're evaluating you, but they are. And so if you don't sort of fit the way that they see an engineer in their organization, then it's going to be hard for them to want to hire you. So those are the two things: a structured approach and this intuitive layer.
Cool. So I wanted to pull that. You talked about what they're looking for, and each company's different. If I'm a candidate and I want to go and apply to, say, Meta or Amazon that you mentioned, how do I figure out what each company is looking for? What's a good way for me to get a handle on that and tailor my preparation for it?
Right, right. I would say that a lot of companies are looking for very similar things, and they're looking for those repeatable behaviors, things that you've done in the past on projects that you've worked on that you could then repeat and replicate once you get inside their organization. And so if you're trying to look for what the specific company is looking for, there's generally two places or maybe three places that you should go. So number one, you should talk to the recruiter. I think every time you have a role that's coming up, an interview that's coming up, you should use that recruiter as your resource and talk to them about what are the things that this interviewer is going to be looking for? What are the aspects of past successful candidates? And hopefully they'd be able to give you even this structured list. So like at Meta, there are 5 different things that the recruiter will tell you. Things like embracing conflict and handling ambiguity and those kind of things, right? So they give you this list. The other place you can go is to a company website. Even if it's a small company, most companies these days have some sort of company value list on their website. You can go and look and say, oh, they value perseverance, or they value empathy, or whatever the thing is that they have identified that they really want their employees to embody. And then the third thing I would say is just search the internet. So I think we have so many resources available to us now, people who are on Reddit or people who are on other forums who have been talking about what their interview experience has been like. So go and take a look and see what kind of questions were asked and see what kind of signals people were acquiring. Yes, certainly. Yes, I think my book is a great opportunity to learn more about what companies value in general. But I think if you're looking for a very specific company, I think the great way to do that is to go to that company website or talk to the recruiters.
Yeah, and for example, as you mentioned, Amazon, they have their leadership principles. They're very front and center about those. They're very clear on their website. They make it very easy to find. So let's pivot slightly. And I mentioned your book. You've written a book about the behavioral interviews. What's your background? What qualifies you to write this book and make it so useful as also for people?
Right. So I was at Meta for over 9 years, almost 10 years. And during my time there, most of my time there, I was the hiring committee chair for iOS and Androids, which means that I, of course, made hiring decisions for all the iOS and Android engineers that we hired during that time, along with a group of other folks. I recruited people for that committee, trained them. We also trained the interviewers. So we picked the questions that we would ask in those mobile interviewing pipelines, and then we trained the interviewers. And specifically, I focused on training the behavioral interviewers. I felt like behavioral interviews was really the place I could see the long-term trajectory of someone's career and understand what their potential was. And oftentimes we were hiring, mid-level and junior engineers, and a lot of that is assessing someone's sort of long-term trajectory. So that really got me interested and excited while I was at Meta. Oh, this behavioral interview thing, where I get this chance to have a conversation about someone's past and understand who they are as a person and how that's going to manifest in the workplace. That was really exciting to me. I conducted over 1,000 big tech behavioral interviews in my time, and then I've also coached over 200 candidates who have been applying at these big FANG roles. So it's been a really exciting time for me the last couple of years to invest in helping people get these really nail these behavioral interviews.
So that's a lot of prep on behavioral interviews. And I think you're right, it would be far more fascinating to do thousands of behavioral interviews than thousands of DSA interviews. There's only so many times you watch somebody do a sliding window bit of code, and then you've kind of seen it.
Yeah,
all.
Oftentimes you're asking the same question when you do these DSA interviews. So really, you are literally asking the same thing and someone gives you the same response, 10 times a week. That gets a little old.
Imagine 1,000 times the same behavioral interview question, you could get 1,000 different answers. We've all lived different lives, had different experiences. You talked a lot about the kind of resilience and the different aspects that we've got there. And you mentioned earlier AI. So do you feel that AI has an added impact on the behavioural interview? Has it made it more important, less important? Has it changed how we prepare?
Yes, certainly. So we know that AI has changed everything about software engineering, and I think it also has changed interviewing. So um, no longer can companies rely on signal of can you just implement XYZ algorithm? That's not no longer particularly interesting to them now that computers can do that themselves. And so companies are going to be more reliant on the other two interview types, system design and behavioral in particular, to assess someone's ability to work in a workplace, work with others, right? If more and more of the code is handled by computers, then more and more of the then we're going to have more and more time for interactions with people. And the kinds of engineers that we need are no longer ones that just take specifications and then implement that specifications. We need engineers who can own the product's stack from top to bottom. So understand the business problem and then be able to align the stakeholders on what the right solution is, to implement the solution, of course, and check the solution, but also to ship and then follow up on those products to understand what should be done next. And those kinds of signals, the ability to identify business problems and align others and follow up and have that kind of ownership, those are the kinds of signals that are assessed in the behavioral interview. So yes, I think AI has changed interviewing in such that behavioral interviews are becoming much, much more important, even for junior engineers than they were in the past.
So a great example of this, I think, was Gene Kim, one of the authors of Vibe Coding and the author of the Phoenix Project, posted today about having vibe coded a tool. And the slowest part of the process now was actually getting approval to deploy it and to access some of the systems they needed for information. Brings back down to it's always a people problem. And you always have to solve that problem by interacting with other people, by going influencing or negotiating. I think, again, reinforces your point that it's as the code becomes cheaper and easier to produce, we've got to focus more on how do we communicate with people, how do we work with them, how do we collaborate them, bring all those things to the front. So pivoting slightly, because obviously FANG companies and big tech companies are big by their nature. You've got a lot of people. Do you think these behavioral interviews still apply for people outside FANG as well?
Of course. Yeah, of course it applies to everyone. Everyone does behavioral interviews. In fact, oftentimes the very first interaction you have with any company is a kind of behavioral interview. So either the conversation you have with the recruiter, or it could be an early call with the hiring manager. So they may not call it an interview, but it is a behavioral interview. You're going to be talking about yourself. You're going to be talking about your past projects. They may ask you a few questions about about things that you've done in the past. So being able to have solid answers to those questions and be ready for those early conversations that get you into those later rounds, that's super common for non-FANG companies. And those are behavioral interviews. But of course, even at the on-site stage, non-FANG companies of all sizes and types employ behavioral interviews. Every company, they want to know those past behaviors that you have had in the past, which predict future results. And every interviewer is trying to answer that question. Will this person be successful here? And they get that answer in the behavioral interview. So that the framework that you apply when you are preparing for behavioral interviews is generally the same, whether it's a FANG interview or a non-FANG interview. It's decode what the person is asking, try to understand what they're trying to get out of the questions that they're asking me, selecting some best story or response that you have from your past, and then being able to deliver that in some kind of compelling way. And that works whether you're applying, at Google, or whether you're applying to a small startup, or even a traditional company that's not a tech company. All that kind of loop, decode, select, deliver, works wonders to be able to showcase your past experience in a behavioral interview.
So a classic example of this is a lot of companies outside of big tech, the first thing that you'll get from a recruiter is, hi Austin, tell me a bit about yourself. What's been your career? Again, as you say, that's a great example, isn't it? What's a good response to that? How should somebody handle it?
This is a super important question. I'm really glad that you brought it up. It is oftentimes the very first thing that you will get in any behavioral interviews. Tell me about yourself. It's so common that it has as an acronym or a name. We call it TMA. Tell me about yourself. So it's really important that you set the stage for the rest of the conversation when you get this tell me about yourself question. So you want to establish yourself as at the scope, at the target level. So if the person is hiring a senior engineer, after that, tell me about yourself, the person needs to think to themselves, yes, this person is a senior engineer, right? If the requirements are sort of to have a deep AI experience, then It needs to come out in that tell me about yourself. So what's the structure for that? Well, I think there's three parts that I like to hear from candidates and tell me about yourself. The first one is some kind of personal introduction, right? So this is, hey, I'm Austen. I have X years experience. I'm a, AI engineer, something like that. Establish yourself as, who you are and what you have done, who you represent to the organization. I also like to add something a little bit more personal, not like, what's your favorite dog breed, but something more specific about how you interact in the world. So perhaps something like, I'm an AI engineer. I love solving people-oriented problems. I love deeply understanding the user's needs and then bringing that back to the company. Something like that. Something that defines you. I think that will help the interviewer remember you after this conversation and make an impression. So that's that first part, some kind of introduction of yourself, personal summary. The second part, and this is where most candidates miss, is give me some list of accomplishments, right? Oftentimes what candidates will do is they'll give me some history lesson. They're like, 10 years ago, I graduated, and then I was at this company, and then I was at this company, and then this company. And that doesn't really give me very much information, right? I can read that on the resume. It doesn't tell me much about you and what you think is valuable and why you think you're ready for the role that you're applying for. So instead, you should give me a kind of greatest hits from the resume. Oh, hey, during my time as an AI engineer, I have delivered, project X to give me, this business value with this technology. And I think that kind of establishes yourself as someone who can deliver for the company, right? Remember that the company is hiring you as an engineer to deliver business value with technology. So some of the first things out of your mouth need to be, I can deliver business value with technology. Let me show you what I did. And then oftentimes what happens after that, even if the candidates do well in that part, they kind of peter out, right? They sort of list some things and then sort of feels like, well, I don't know what to say. And then it kind of gets a little awkward. And I like to sort of bat the tennis ball back to the interviewer by ending your tell me about yourself with some kind of forward-looking statement. So this is something like, hey, I'm really excited to come to company, Acme Co. because I think that this company will do something for my career, or because I'm excited about the product, or because something truthful about why you're excited about the role. And I think that's a great way to send the tennis ball, in a sense, back to the interviewer and let them ask their next question.
So I've seen a lot of people take that approach, not the batting back. I think a lot of people fall short on that, but they, hi, I'm John. I've been a software engineer for 29 years. This is what I've done. But what that is kind of rehearsed and repetitive, and they use it the same everywhere. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, I think that it is good to rehearse and practice, I will say, in general. I think practice it helps you be less nervous when you're in those interviews. Interviews are very, we all know interviews can be a very nervous environment, a place where under a lot of pressure, and the stakes are very high, as we talked about earlier. So I do think practice is important. I think practice can also make you a little leaden. It can make you a little bit dry, right? And I think if you appear to be just reading something off of a screen with a flat, monotone voice, I do think that does not leave a great impression. And so I actually talk about this in the book, how to make a genuine connection, with someone, especially over a video call. It's much harder over a video call when you're not there in person. And most of these interviews are done over video. So I think that having that early time in the conversation where you are smiling, where you are mimicking the other person's facial expressions, and where you are sort of leaning in, where you're engaging with them, where you're talking with them a little bit, and then that tell me about yourself. Yes, practice it, but I think if you deliver it without reading it and delivering it without having to memorize it, I do think that will make it a little bit more lively, right?
Okay. What about tailoring it for each company and for each interview?
I think this can be really valuable. So certainly you need to understand what it is the company values. So if this is a back-end engineering role, then I need to choose the projects from my past, choose my accomplishments, which are relevant to the role for sure, right? Just as you would on a resume. Every time you send a resume, you're tailoring that resume for that specific role based on the job description. And the same kind of thing for this tell me about yourself. When you're talking to a hiring manager at a company and you know what they need and you know what they're looking for, make sure that you include what they're looking for in that tell me about yourself.
Yeah, so that brings us nicely on to, you get into the interview, you settle into it proper, they're going to have several questions. I think a lot of these are typical about 45 minutes, is that right?
Yeah, 45 to 60 minutes for sure.
So you're going to get, again, I've never done a behavioral interview for big tech, so correct me if I'm wrong, please, Austin, but you're going to get maybe 5 to 6 questions in that time that you'll get asked, and they'll explore, and then they'll dig a little bit deeper. How do you pick the 5 or 6 stories that you're going to tell in that session? What's the process for that?
Yeah, really good question. And yes, that's correct. Usually 4, to 7 questions, depends on how long the interviewer wants to dive into each story. So oftentimes what candidates do is, when they're preparing for behavioral interviews, is they will just try to get a list. Like, let me see what list of questions Meta asks or Google asks. I'm going to get this list, and I'm going to, prep each one of these responses, and then I'll be ready. And this is how you approach a system design interview. This is how you approach a elite code interview, a DSA interview. So yeah, it makes sense, right? I'll do the same thing for the behavioral. That's not a really good reason. That's not a good way to handle behavioral interviews. You should do, that's kind of like maybe a top-down approach. Like, figure what they're going to ask, and then go answer it, and then I'll be ready. Instead, I recommend that you do a bottom-up approach, which is think about your career, think about what are the most impactful projects, what are the most meaningful decisions you've made, what are the obstacles that you've overcome, what are the kinds of tangible results, the measurable effect that you've had on the business. Identify those stories first. And I call these your core stories. If you spend some time journaling about them, looking over your resume, looking over your past performance reviews, even talking to old coworkers, it's a great way to surface what are these most, what are the few stories that I would want to tell a hiring manager if I just had a few minutes. And then prepare to tell those stories. And oftentimes those stories will have many different aspects to them. They may have ownership because maybe you came up with the idea, or maybe you drove it through some difficult challenges that the project had. Maybe they have conflicts that you were involved with because you had to work with a lot of different people. Maybe there's a lot of ambiguity in those projects because you had to sit down and figure out what to do for each one of those projects. So I think that those core stories can be used for lots of different questions. And then what you do is you might want to spend a little bit of time taking a look at my book, for example, where I list out the 8 different signal areas that companies look for. Take a look at your core stories, compare them to these signal areas, things like perseverance, conflict resolution, ambiguity, right? And see where they're not fitting, right? Maybe there's a couple of these signal areas that I haven't covered in these core stories. Think about some specific stories that might fit into those signal areas. So now you have a set of core stories, you have a set of additional stories, which covers all these signal areas. And if you add your company values for whatever the target company that you're applying for, great. Now you have this corpus, or this story catalogs, what I call it. Then you can use the story catalog to answer any question. So then once you're in the interview, you receive a question. Maybe the question is like, tell me about a project that was really ambiguous, or that had where you had to push through a challenge or a difficulty. And because you've spent some time journaling about these projects, because you've aligned them to these signal areas, you can identify the signal area for the question. That's the decode part that I talked about earlier. And if you're in a remote interview, you can even have these notes up on your screen and say, okay, I see that this is a question about perseverance. Like, these are the stories I should use, and pick one of those stories and then deliver it. So I recommend that you spend some time with your career, with your resume, identifying these stories, and then aligning them to signal areas that companies value, and then being prepared to pair those in the interview once you decode the question.
So you have a couple of great sections in the book about this that I went through as a beta reader, and in the book, must have been about August, I think. I actually lost a couple of days in doing this. I found it really interesting to read through that, and then ended up going through and writing out a whole bunch of my stories. And I've got about 15 pages of notes now that will make great stories for posts on LinkedIn or for the podcast in the future. And I thought it was great the way you described that, and the content you give people for going through your career, going through your CV, thinking about the different signal areas. And like I say, I surfaced hundreds of stories, many of which I've forgotten about. So it was a bit of a trip down memory lane, but also so useful and a great structure to go through that. So once we've found all those stories, what then makes a good story, and how do you craft it into a good story?
Yeah, great question. So let's go all the way back to first principles here and understand, what makes a great interview story, right? We're not talking about making a blockbuster movie. So I think a great story is one that has clearly presented actions. Remember that this interview is called the behavioral interview. So they want to see what behaviors you have demonstrated in the past that you can then replicate in their organization. So it needs to clearly present those actions. It needs to have enough context, or, if I just list out to you a bunch of stuff that I did, I debugged this, I built this, like what are we doing here? What's the point of this story? So you need to have some kind of context to understand those actions, and then to create some kind of, like any story has some sort of problem, action, resolution arc to the story. And then we need to have enough results to understand whether those actions were the right ones. So yeah, anybody can do a bunch of stuff, but did that produce any meaningful output? And then it needs to be kind of interesting, right? I mean, interesting enough for a career story, which in this context means that it's relevant to the role. So if you're telling a story that doesn't have aspects that the company is looking for, or maybe doesn't necessarily fit their kind of technology or their kind of business problems, that's going to be less relevant, less interesting to the interviewer than one that is fitting in with what the role requires. And then it needs to be short, right? So the interviewer has other questions to ask. So the longer you go, it's very risky to use so much time telling one particular story. So what does that mean? How can we accomplish all this? And there is a really easy mnemonic that you can use to remember how to create stories like this. And it is context, actions, results, learnings. You may have heard of the STAR method: situation, task, action, results. It's another one, but I prefer context, action, results, learning. So when you present this context in the beginning, telling people, what is this about? Where was I? What was the business problem? That's the most important thing. Why are we doing this project? Not just that there was a refactor happening, but what were the problems that that precipitated this refactor? What was the business situation that required us to go and build this new feature? Then a healthy list of actions, and this is where a lot of people, they don't give me enough actions. They don't give me enough repeatable behaviors. And sometimes people don't understand all the different things they did in a project. They tell me something like, oh yeah, we had this, like, manager gave me this feature. It was important for XYZ reasons. I built it, I shipped it, and then they kind of go on to the results section, right? But the building and the shipping, like, that's what I'm hiring you to do. I need to hear more about what that part, right? What are all those things that you did in order to identify how to build it and how to ship it and whether it was the right thing, right? How you measured success. All those pieces that are in the middle of the actions is the most important part. And then results. So remember, we need to talk about why it was important for us to solve this problem. And then ending strongly with some kind of learnings, like what you got out of this project, or what you would have done differently, or what you took away from this project to do something later.
I think that's possibly because of the way STAR has been presented, that everyone focuses on what was the result. Kind of, it's the punctuating bit of STAR. And, what you did gets kind of lost as I set it up, talk about the result and how well you did, pat yourself on the back and talk about how brilliant you are, and think that that's the win rather than actually the actions. And I hadn't heard of Carl before we spoke in the past, but I really like that because there's more of an emphasis on the learnings, because you've got those repeatable actions, but also what did you learn from it? Because if you learn from it, you're going to do that plus something better in future. So I really like that. Want to go back to Carl. I think a lot of people miss, when I've seen them do behavior interviews on both sides, that context has to be of a business outcome. I think that's fundamental from my point of view. Do you agree?
Oh, for sure. So I think that this is oftentimes the difference between maybe a junior engineer and a senior engineer. Oftentimes a junior engineer will describe projects in terms of technical outputs. So like, oh, we needed to improve, we need to improve performance, or I needed to build this feature, right? And provide sort of no sense of like, why is that even the thing that the company is hiring you to do? Like, why does the company even care about that thing? And I think a more senior engineer, and especially certainly in the staff and principal levels, they're starting with that, right? Starting with that, so what, right? Starting with that, how is this going to change the world? How is this going to change the company? And I like to tell my coaching clients to describe this project like Steve Jobs would describe this project, right? He wouldn't start saying like, oh yes, we had this like a technical beeps and boops that we needed to accomplish, right? He would say, imagine that you're in this place, right? And you need this thing. don't you want that, right? And then I was like, yes, yes, I want that thing. And then you would go and tell me about how you built that thing. So I think that kind of framing of what is the so what, how would Steve Jobs approach this problem is really what you want to get out of that context section.
Yeah, I like that. It's really focused, isn't it? And he didn't stand up there and say, we want another MP3 player. He went, imagine 10,000 songs in your pocket. That was a big vision that could excite people. So you talked about stories there, and you sort of hinted at don't go over too long and too much detail. And we talked earlier about this interview is going to be 45 to 60 minutes, and you're going to do 5 to 7 stories. So, that's roughly 5 to 7, maybe 8 minutes a story, depending on that. How long should your story be? And what's a kind of indication of whether or not it's landing with the interviewer?
Yeah. This is going to depend on seniority and what kind of story you're telling, and also where you are in the interview. So if you're early in the interview, the interviewer is probably wanting to hear more from you than less, right? They don't know you yet. You haven't established yourself as someone who can solve the problems that the interviewer is looking for you to solve when they bring you onto their team. So they're probably more willing to listen to longer stories. Now, later on in the interview, they may be looking for very specific things. Maybe they're looking just for conflict resolution, or maybe they're looking, just for perseverance, right? They're trying to assess you on some specific aspect. And in that world, you need to sort of get to the point so you can go to the next thing that they want to assess you on, right? Because it benefits you as the candidate to cover as many of your career stories as possible. So what does that mean, right? So I think in the beginning, when you are responding to stories, a couple of minutes, 3 minutes, maybe 4 minutes max, right, for delivering a story early on. If you are delivering a longer story, maybe you're a very senior engineer and it's a multi-year project, and the person is clearly asking you, like, hey, tell me about the thing that you are most proud of, right? It's like a very open-ended question. I call it a trunk question, right? Clearly they're looking for some sort of big response, right? I think that it's really important that you organize that response, and so that you have some kind of a table of contents at the beginning, like, there's 4 or 5 different parts of this story that are really interesting. One, how I came up with the idea. The second one is how I aligned the stakeholders. And the third one is how I solved some interesting technical problems along the way. And the fourth one is how I was able to ship this in a gradual way to ensure it was the right thing for the users, et cetera, et cetera. Then you can go and tell each part of the story. And it's very similar to how a speaker might use a slide deck, right? So that every time you change slides, it'll move from section to section. The audience sort of wakes up and re-engages with your content. So if you are going to tell a longer story, definitely have it be very organized. A couple other rules of thumb and things that you can apply when you're telling these stories. So if you find yourself talking, which oftentimes we do, right, as candidates, we're nervous, so we just keep talking, ask yourself, when's the last time I said an action? When's the last time I said something that I did? Some kind of repeatable thing that I could do inside of this organization that I'm applying in. If it's been a while since you've said an action, either get to an action or stop, stop talking. Because those are the things that the interviewer is looking for. They're looking for those actions. I think the other thing you can do is, of course, you are watching the person's response, right? If they're nodding, if they're taking notes, if they're engaged in the story, then you probably have a little bit more runway, and you can and keep talking. If they've stopped taking notes, if they are looking off the screen, oftentimes you can tell if someone is using their mouse, or it's typing in the other window, right? Maybe this is not a great story, or maybe we need to stop and understand what they're looking for. So I think you can use those kinds of people signals to understand whether or not you're talking too long.
So you also mentioned, Austen, that we want to get as many stories as possible across, and we've got a limited time. So let's say I've gone through my stories and I'm interviewing for example, for manager role. And somebody says, how do you handle poor performance? Now I've got 10, 15 stories about that. Do I just pick one? Do I try and talk about 2 or 3? What's the approach that you mentioned there? You describe an approach to handling this in the book. So what would that be?
Yeah, for sure. Right. So the second step, we've decoded. That's the first step. We understand what the signal is. So in this case, we're looking for your ability to lead others, your ability to coach. Right. That's the kind of signal that we're looking at for this question. Then it comes to this select stage. How do I select a story? And there's 4 different aspects that I coach my clients to use when they're choosing one of these stories, and they're in a prioritized order. So the first and most important part of choosing a story is the story's scope. So if you choose, maybe the story is like really fits the question, but doesn't showcase the kind of work that you can do, doesn't showcase you operating at the scope of the target role. So let's say the target role is like a senior engineering manager in this particular case. Then I need to showcase a story that says that I am operating at this level. So the scope is probably the most important thing, even more important than fit to the question. Because if I'm telling all these core stories that I've identified, all these things that all these parts of my career that I really want to showcase to a hiring manager that I think represent my best work, if you've gotten out those stories at the end of the interview, I think you've been successful as a candidate. And then it's on the interviewer's side to decide if that's what they want for their organization. But if you get to the end of the interview and you feel like, I really wish I could have told the story about, when I pitched the CEO on this big project that made a big business impact. Well, if you didn't get a chance to tell it, you've lost your opportunity. So I think scope is probably the most important thing. Now, the story does have to fit the signal area. We talked about that earlier, understanding what the interviewer is looking for. So relevance is the number two thing. So you need to consider whether the story delivers the kind of signal that the interviewer is looking for. The third consideration I would think about is what I call uniqueness. So ideally, you've been able to tell different stories throughout the course of the interview. Now, sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes you need to go back to a story you've already told. Maybe you're telling it in a slightly different way, or you're expanding on a different part of that story. This happens frequently when people ask about conflict resolution, for example. Then people want to go back and say, I remember that project I told you about that, it was a 1-year project, big build. This had this conflict in it. Let me tell you about it. That's okay. But again, ideally, you're being able to tell as many of these core stories as possible. So uniqueness is that third consideration. And the fourth one I would say is recency. So of course we all know that recent stories are more relevant to the interviewer than older stories. And of course the reason for this is because you are more likely to be performing at the level of your more recent stories than you were in the past. So there's a lot of considerations around recency, but if all else being equal, I would choose the more recent story. Now sometimes it's okay to go back to older stories. This happens especially for people with longer careers where the impact and the scope of what they've done varies greatly over the years. And so I think you can get away with telling older stories.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yes, of course, right. Aren't we all glad to hear people with 20 plus years experience? We're all glad to hear that we can go back to older stories. But generally, my rule is you should think really hard about telling a story that's more than 3 years old. I think that is a somewhat of a risky move.
Okay, so let's say I'm being asked about conflict resolution, and it's tell me about a time you've handled conflict resolution at the executive level. So presumably a better worded question there. And I've got 3 stories of how I've handled conflict resolution at the executive level. They're all like scope, they're all similar recency. How do I handle that? Do I pick one? Do I offer them a choice? What would be the approach there?
Right. It sort of depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I assume there is something different about each one of these stories. Otherwise, if they're all really very similar in all aspects, then it truly does not matter which one you pick. But oftentimes that's not the case. So typically, maybe there's one that involves a product choice, or one that involves a technical choice, or some difference between them. And I think you can choose one. You can do that. But oftentimes it's a great opportunity for you to enlist the interviewer's help. And I call this the menu technique. So if you're not really sure which story the interviewer wants to hear about, you can simply offer them a choice, right? I have this story, I have this story. Now, the challenge with this is you need to give them some information about each one of these stories in a very compact way and in a relevant way for them to choose which story they want to hear. So how would you do that? I would not say something like, well, there was Project X and there was Project Y, right? I as an interviewer, I don't know about Project X or Project Y. I don't know what these things are, right? I don't know which one to pick. But if you say, there was one where we had a conflict over product direction and one where we had a conflict over technical direction. I think this is giving the listener a very distinct difference between what they're going to get from listening to you when you tell the story. And maybe they say, I want someone with a more technical focus in this role, or I want someone with a more product focus in this role, and then they'll choose accordingly.
Will that also help or hinder to be able to present the fact that, hey, it's not just that I've had this one experience, I'm showing you a breadth of experience because I can talk about, you say, this technical focus conflict with the CTO, and this product focus conflict with the CEO, and I had a financial focus conflict with the CFO. Which story would you like? Is that adding value to your presentation or not? What do you think?
For sure. I mean, to me, you're communicating that you have been in many different environments. You've had an impact across the organization. In the specific example that you're giving me, where I'm now having lots of interactions with different senior leaders in the organization, and that's a very clear signal.
Cool, excellent. So coming back to story preparation, one of the mistakes that I mean, and particularly when we talked about conflict resolution, is I've seen a number of staff and principal level engineers outside of big tech largely, but we're still fairly senior people who are very, very bad at conflict resolution. And they'll come up along with stories where I disagreed with somebody, we talked about it, and then we agreed to do my way or their way. It's a very weak story. How could somebody typically improve on that? What would be the things that we really drill down into to give them actionable steps to turn that into a useful story or to find a better story?
Yeah, I love that you chose conflict resolution because it's so common that we have this particular problem where someone sort of yada yada yadas over the interesting part or sort of skips over the juicy part of the conflict. That's really common. And so then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it about conflict resolution that an interviewer is really interested in? They're interested in the repeatable actions. I keep coming back to that. The repeatable actions that you have done in the past. For conflict resolution, repeatable actions are things like listening to someone's to what the conflict is, listening to someone else's approach, empathizing with them, understanding where they're coming from. Actions like collecting data, right? I went back and I collected this research data, or I ran this analysis, or talking to other people, right? That is an action that you can do. Oh, I'm going to gather input and feedback from other folks. Actions like, oh, I decided to communicate with them, right? We oftentimes forget about that in the conflict resolution stories. How did you communicate with them? Did you go and talk to them in person? Did you send them a Slack message? Did you send them an email? Other actions that oftentimes people have in conflict resolution stories are things like involving other leaders. So perhaps I needed to escalate this. Why did you escalate? What was the thinking? And oftentimes this is an action that people totally forget about, is thinking is an action. Oh, in this situation, I thought that this executive wanted more data or was very user focused. So therefore I needed to collect some user research in order to convince them of this thing. That kind of thinking is repeatable in organizations. And so I think oftentimes the end of these stories is also left out. Things like, well, what happens to the relationship after this conflict is resolved, where maybe you got to the end of the business conflict, or you decided to do XYZ, whatever it was, but you burned your relationship with them and they never want to work with you again. So those are the kinds of parts that oftentimes people forget in these conflict resolution stories. And so if your story doesn't have these things, perhaps like you were hinting at, maybe it was a conflict that this person just sort of gave up or gave in to whatever you wanted. Maybe that's not a great story. Go look for those stories where you demonstrated some of those repeatable actions.
Yeah, and I think that the one I'm thinking of was particularly bad in that perhaps somebody steered away from wanting to present too much conflict. It's like that question, what's your biggest weakness? So many people have been told that you pretend a strength is a weakness to answer that question. I think conflict resolution is in the same area. A lot of people will not want to say, well, I had a major falling out with somebody. Instead, they'll be like, well, we disagreed slightly about something. And we disagreed slightly about whether or not we should format our code with X or Y. Isn't really a conflict, is it? We want something a bit more juicy than that. Doesn't mean you've got to go around being toxic and falling out with people, but we can have genuine conflict in the workplace, can't we? And something that's useful about product direction, or do we invest in this or that?
Right. Don't take the drama out of your conflict resolution stories. The drama is what the person is there to hear about. They want to understand how you handled a difficult situation at work. And so if you sort of if you paste over or whitewash this difficult challenge that you had and make it seem like it wasn't a big deal, then you're not showcasing the kind of depth of conflict resolution skills that you demonstrated.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just tease an example here. Hopefully won't embarrass myself or anyone involved. Several years ago, I worked for a company and I identified that there were some problems in the technology. I wrote up a summary of this and shared it with a few other engineers. One of the engineers thought he was being a bit clever by sharing this with the CTO. The CTO got a bit upset and sent me a very long ranting email about this. So I could present this in a conflict resolution story of, I wrote up some problems with our technology, the CTO was upset, he sent me an email telling me how upset he was, I talked to him, we settled it, everything was happy, we fixed the technology. What have I done wrong there? Why is that going to fall flat?
Right. So it falls flat because it doesn't demonstrate any repeatable actions that you performed in order to resolve the conflict. So we're looking for something that if you experience a conflict in the interviewer's organization, what are you going to do? What are the actions that you're going to take? So that's why this story falls flat. Is there's not enough of things that you did, actions that you took in order to move the conflict forward and resolve the conflict.
So let's iterate that and try and make it a little bit better so we can show some of this in action then. So if instead I present it as, I wrote up a list of problems with our technology in the company. I shared this private with a couple of engineers to get their feedback. One of them decided to be a little bit cute and shared it with the CTO. The CTO was one of the founders of the business, and this was his baby. And I had just, to his mind, criticized it. I had just said, and this is the way he interpreted it, because he wasn't the intended audience for the content of this report, but I had just destroyed his baby, told him it was ugly, it didn't work, it was terrible, and it needed to be thrown away. And at least that's how he read it. So he sent me a long 2,000 or 3,000 word email, very upset, very stressed, and clearly absolutely distraught by the approach and what he thought I was going to do. Now, I approached this I read his email and I realized that he was very, very upset. I knew already he was fairly emotional, and obviously he's very emotionally invested as a founder of this business. So I could have just hammered out a reply, but instead I thought I'd get up and go and walk over, still in the office in those days, go to his desk and go and ask him for a chat. And I took him out of the office. We went across the road to a coffee shop, and I sat down and apologized at how he got exposed to this email, talked him through why it wasn't ready for his audience at the time, and I was gaining feedback, and I was disappointed that this engineer had created this situation by sending it to him as an early draft. Told him how I wanted to involve him in the process later on, and explained what I was trying to achieve and how we were going to go about it. And then, as we are now at the point where he was involved, explained to him how I wanted his help and how I respected his opinion, how I needed it, and how I'd wanted enough time to prepare my case so that I didn't look like a fool presenting to him. And then talked about how we will work together in future, and again sought his feedback on how he'd prefer me to handle these things in future. We left that coffee shop with a good working relationship, and we had a solid working relationship for the rest of the time we worked together. And I learned he was even more emotionally invested in this than I had believed. I learned a lot better about how to work with him, and that I could involve him early in these stages, and that he would be happier seeing early drafts and being aware of this. So have I taken on board the things you said? How does that story improve, and how could we improve it to the next level?
That's a great story, because now I see all these repeatable actions that you did, right? So first I understand a little bit more about the context, and I understand about why you had this conflict with the CTO. So one thing we haven't talked about so far is what are some red flags or concerns that interviewers may have when they are assessing you. And so if you tell me a story about a conflict you had with an executive, I will always assume that the whether or not it's right or not, I will typically assume that the executive is the one that is quote unquote right, right? So in this case, I want to see, is this a reasonable conflict? Are you going to be a difficult coworker? Are you going to be somebody that creates problems, right, for the executive team? So in this case, it's really clear how you got to this sort of conflict with the CTO, and that it is, in a sense, like not necessarily your fault, right? So that's helpful. Also, I see a lot of empathy signals from this kind of story. So there's a clear understanding of where the person was coming from. And you also have a lot of great actions that involve communication. So you chose, you tell me a little bit more about how you initially got into this conflict, which was an email. And then you also tell me about how you communicated with the CTO, pulling them into a sort of neutral space, making sure that they're comfortable, right? Reinforcing your commitment to the organization, and also apologizing, right? That's really important. There's a humility aspect there, or there's like a part of learning or growth. I would want someone on my team that is willing to apologize. And then you also you end this the conversation, or you end the story with a strong understanding that the relationship with the CTO was better, and that you were working even better together in the future. And so that part of that story is really good. Oh, one other thing that I didn't mention, which I really liked, was the thinking. So I think you showcased why you took this step, why you wanted to take the CTO, to the cafe, or why you wanted to tell him this or that. And that kind of, peeling back the layers and looking under the hood to see what you're going through when you're going through this conflict is really is very repeatable, right? Something that I would assess. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't have like a ton of improvement for that story. Sounds good. Did you have something in mind?
I was just trying to think of some concrete examples we can give to people. So that's one from my past. Let's think a little bit more, if we could do the same exercise again, if you're cool with that, about somebody at more junior mid-level. So let's take a situation where we have a couple of junior stroke mid-level engineers, and one of them thinks that we should go for SQL, one of them thinks we should go for NoSQL. Unless maybe they present their story initially as, hi, I'm Bob. I had a disagreement with Steve about whether or not we should use SQL or NoSQL. We talked about the technologies, and we decided that NoSQL was better.
Right. So in an example like this, you're not showcasing a couple of key things. So one of them is you're not showcasing any kind of judgment, or like why you were even interested in this particular implementation choice, which is a loss of opportunity. You could have showcased your technical thinking, your ability to pair business problems with technology. All those parts are an opportunity. So you could say something like, hey, we had this conflict over SQL or NoSQL. I wanted SQL because I felt like the data was very structured. It was unlikely to change in the future because we needed, I don't know, whatever it was, like fast reads, something like that. So I think that those kinds of thinking of why you were advocating for a certain choice, that's really important. Now we come to the conflict part. So you have a conflict with this engineer. What did you do, right? How did the conflict even arise? Was it a conflict over a pull request? Was it a conflict in a meeting? What was happening, right? Those kinds of details are important for me, and I gather a lot of signal from listening to those things. You could say something like, we were in a team meeting and deciding what to do for the architecture of the project going forward, and I mentioned that we should choose SQL. Another engineer said they know SQL. Now, this is the part where you have an opportunity to tell me more about the emotional environment of this conflict. So was this a sort of neutral conflict where people were very level-headed? Maybe. Maybe it was also a conflict where they were not. They felt really passionate. Oh, my last job, and they were really advocating for this particular approach, and they felt very strongly about it. And so what did you do? Well, maybe you said, you know what, why don't we do this? Why don't we make a list of pros and cons offline. We'll build a document. We'll gather some feedback, right? So immediately you have decreased the emotional intensity of this conflict, and you have sort of shifted the conflict more towards objective way to make a decision. So then you say, oh, I wrote the document. I had this other engineer write the document. We then presented it in the next team meeting. I collected this data based on our past usage, based on what are our other projects that we have implemented, and what has worked and what hasn't worked. They did the same. We presented it in the meeting, and then we came to a consensus. And then you can say, I really understood about where they were coming from. They had this idea or this idea or this idea that made a lot of sense, but I felt like my approach was better because XYZ, right? So here you're showcasing empathy, you're showcasing the ability to understand where someone is coming from, and then also giving some technical signal about why you think your approach is best. Then you can conclude the story and say something like, well, in that team meeting, the team agreed with me. I then went to the engineer and I said, I really appreciated the kind of energy and effort they put into their presentation. And I felt like I agreed with XYZ, but I felt like this other part was more important. And they understood that. And then our working relationship was strong going forward. We were able to implement this project, with this SQL database, and we were successful because of blah, 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 blah. So I think you've expanded the story a lot by showcasing what are the kind of thinking, the kind of empathy, the kind of actions that you would take in this conflict resolution situation.
So I think a lot of junior engineers in that situation might also end up escalating, whether it's to a more senior or staff principal engineer or to a manager, but are probably afraid of mentioning that in an interview because they think that, I escalated kind of means that I can't solve the problem myself. I'm still very junior. So maybe they fear mentioning that. You kind of presented something different earlier in that talk. What would your advice be for that?
Yeah, I do think that escalation is okay. It is an action. I think I mentioned it earlier, and I'm really glad that you asked this question. I think that escalation is okay in conflict resolution situations if you provide me the motivation for the escalation. So if it was, hey, we both disagreed. We had talked about it ourselves first, right? We had tried to resolve it ourselves, but we were not able to. And so we appealed to the senior engineer or to the manager. Then I want to know how you did that, right? Did you go around the other engineer's back and sort of message them privately and try to get them on your side? That's one set of signal. Maybe that's not the best signal. Or did you say, hey, why don't we go and present this to the senior engineer or to the architect or whatever the role is? And then let's go see what they think, right? I think that this kind of, do I bring my conflict buddy, the person I'm having the conflict with, do I bring them along with me in the escalation? That's an important signal. So escalation is not something that you should avoid talking about, but the important parts are why you did it and how you did it. And, sometimes I don't generally advocate this for junior engineers, but if you ended up being wrong or the team chose another place, they didn't choose your choice, they chose somebody else's choice. I think that's a lot harder story to tell, but it does demonstrate humility and the ability to disagree and commit.
That's interesting. So you wouldn't pick a story where you have a disagree and commit?
So I think it depends. It depends a lot on the level and where I'm at in the interview. If this is the first conflict resolution story that I'm going to pick, I would typically not pick a story where you were wrong. And the reason is because even if it was a story where it demonstrated great conflict resolution skills and you had a lot of different actions that contributed to resolving the conflict, I think the interviewer is going to question whether you make good decisions if you end up being wrong in the conflict. So certainly initially, it's better to tell a story where you were right and had great conflict resolution skills. If you are a more senior person and you've already established that you have good judgment, for example, then maybe you do want to land a signal about your ability to disagree and commit, or your ability to be humble, or it has some subtlety that you want to communicate. So I think it's not a great story if in the context section of the story, like the very outset, the interviewer can say, "Yep, you were wrong." So I think that's a very dangerous story to tell. And this works. This applies to weaknesses as well. Whenever we're talking about difficult things that you've encountered or challenges you've had or failures you've had, right? Any time where the context itself is setting up the interviewer to say, "Yep, you were wrong. I know exactly where the story is going to go," I think that's a pretty risky story. And now they're seeing that you pursue avenues that are unlikely to be fruitful. That's not a great look for you.
Keep the disagree and commit strictly to kind of where you're showing how you can be a team player rather than dealing with the conflict. Okay, cool. In the part of the book, you mentioned the big three. What is the big three, Austen?
Earlier, I said you should not prepare for a behavioral interview by thinking about what are the questions, and then let me just go and answer those questions. Well, there are three exceptions to that. These are the three questions that you are very likely to get in any behavioral interview, like 5 nines. So one of them is tell me about yourself. We talked about that one. The next one is you're going to get some opportunity to tell a story about a big project. It could be phrased as tell me about your favorite project, tell me about your most impactful project. It could even be the first project story they ask you, something like tell me about a really ambiguous project. You're very likely to tell and pick one big project story to tell. So it's really important that you have a good response to that. And then just like we talked about a moment ago, the third one is conflict resolution. So you are very likely to be asked about when you had a conflict to resolve. Those are our big three questions. If you can nail those big three questions in a 45-minute interview, that might take you 20 minutes. That's half the time, right? And I think if you can deliver a solid signal for those three questions, you are very likely to be hired.
Excellent. So there's a follow-on to that I want to pull out a bit more. So When they're asking, are they expecting that they ask the question and you answer it perfectly and then you move on to the next question? Or is it a good sign if they have follow-ups? Or is it a bad sign if they ask a follow-up?
There are different kinds of interviewers. I think there are probably two primary types of interviewers. One person is a more conversationalist. They are interested in having a back and forth. They may ask you a lot of follow-up questions. They are more interested in longer stories. They are trying to sort of understand the gestalt of your career and then derive some conclusions from that. There's another kind of interviewer who's more of an interrogator, and they have a list of questions that they are trying to go through, and they want to get to each one. And maybe they think that breadth, right, a breadth across your career in that way is more interesting than the first interview, which might be going more for depth. So you can usually tell what kind of interview you're going to get in the first few moments, first few questions. You'll know what you're going to get. I think to answer your question, a lot of times people will ask follow-up questions. They ask different kinds of follow-up questions. Sometimes it's just a clarifying question, like, tell me about, more about this part or more about that part. If it's a clarifying question, sometimes that's a signal to you that you should tell more detail, like whatever in the responses that you're having in the rest of the interview. Maybe they want to know a little bit more. Sometimes those follow-up questions can be kind of gnarly or kind of like pointed. And this is where you need to be on your guard. So when someone asks you, and maybe you tell the story about every factor, and they asked you like, tell me about the challenges the system was having in advance, right? And this is not just a I'm curious context kind of question. They're looking to understand, was this refactor really necessary and meaningful? And did you really need to do it? And so you need to deliver on what they are looking for. So you apply that same decode, select, deliver cycle that we talked about earlier, even to follow-up questions. Pause for a moment, understand, why are they asking me this question? What are they looking for? Let me make sure that I give that to them, in that response.
I think you described this in the book as thinking about the question behind the question.
Exactly. So what is the thing that they're trying to get at? Why is this a relevant question for this conversation? Behavioral interview is not simply a low stakes hangout at a bar and we're having a conversation. It is the interviewer trying to predict and forecast whether or not you'll be successful in their company and in their role. And every question they ask you is related to that forecast.
So one of the mistakes that I think people make quite often in this is that you ask your question and then I'm sat here thinking, I've got to answer, and people rush into answering it. Is it okay to pause for a few seconds and think carefully about your answer first?
Yeah, in fact, I recommend you pause for a moment so that you can do that decode step, so that you can think, why are they asking me this question? Now, I think preparation and being confident in telling those core stories that we talked about earlier, having prepared a call, answer, context, actions, result, learnings for each of these core stories you want to tell will really help you a lot, because you will have a little bit more time there just to pause and make sure that you're choosing the right story, make sure that you're understanding the question. And then when it comes to delivery, you have practiced delivering the story in the past. You kind of know where it's going to go and you feel a bit more confident there. It gives you a bit more of that leeway to spend time not constructing an answer during those first few moments of pausing, but just making sure that you're choosing the right story for the right question.
So pattern matching, if you will, to what's the question behind the question? What is the signal area they're looking for? How do I make sure I've picked the best story that I have for that, and then deliver it, perhaps focusing on the right elements of that? What about when we turn it around, you get to the end of the interview and the interviewer says, do you have any questions for me? What's your advice for how you handle that?
This is a big part of interviews that people don't prepare for. So they think this is just a fluff part at the end of the end. Maybe the interviewer is trying to make me feel comfortable or something. But no, this is part of the evaluation process as well. As an interviewer, I'm looking to see what are the questions that you ask and what does that say about you? So this is a time for you, honestly, to learn something about the role, learn something about the company, about the manager, about whoever you're talking to. So you should ask insightful questions. And I think that there are probably, 5 different areas of things you could ask about. As a candidate, you can ask about the team. So what is the focus of the team, for example, or what are the challenges they have? You could ask about the role, like what does success look like in this role going forward, right? What's been the most successful person that you've had in this role, something like that. You could ask about the company. Hey, what are the major bets that the company's making? Or, what are the major competitors that they have or something like this? You could ask if you're talking to the hiring manager and you know that this is going to be your manager that you're chatting with. You could ask about their management style or how they've coached people in the past, those kinds of things. Or we always go software as a team sport, so we work with other folks. So you could ask about the partnerships that the team has and that the engineers have on the team. How do they collaborate with design? How do they collaborate with product management? And so these questions that you choose are communicating to the interviewer what's important to you. And that's an important signal that they acquire. And so you should prepare some. I wouldn't prepare more than 2, 3, right? You're not going to have a lot of time at the end. But do prepare some questions. And I would suggest that if you have multiple interview rounds, like maybe have a coding round, maybe a system design round, maybe you have a time with the recruiter, or maybe you have a conversation with the hiring manager, maybe you have a behavioral interview. There's lots of different rounds. I would suggest that you ask different questions because I think it showcases that you're thinking about what is the specific information I want from whoever you're talking to in that moment. And I think that that's a maturity signal that companies are looking for.
I always find this very interesting, and maybe I should go and interview at big tech to experience what good looks like here, because there are many interviews over my career where I have come along and I have lots of questions I've prepared, and I have sat there as a candidate and asked my questions and found that the person interviewing me is woefully underprepared on those. Well, I have in every single one, pretty much I will always ask, what does success look like in the next 90, 180 and 365 days? And I had some appalling answers from, we're both happy, to, I haven't thought about that yet.
All right. This is giving you a strong signal about the company, right? This is giving you a strong signal about the person. Yes.
And I've been shocked at how woefully unprepared an awful lot of hiring managers are to answer that kind of question. When I say, what does good look like? What's the key measurements for this success of this hire? Or, what was good about the last person you hired? Or, this role is a replacement. I can see that the last person was so-and-so. Why did they move on? What was good about them?
Exactly. Yeah.
Why is this role now vacant? And it's been quite informative. And I have seen a couple of managers even kind of slag off the last person in the role, which is, a massive red flag. And at that point, it's okay, we'll move on and pursue another option. So that's given me great feedback as a candidate. What other things that can we use as feedback loops for a candidate to help us improve our behavioural interview? So again, I think you've talked about multi-stages at Big Tech and Fang. How can you leverage some feedback there and improve your process as a candidate?
The biggest challenge with behavioral interviews is that it's very difficult to get a feedback loop to understand if you're doing well in a behavioral interview. And this is probably one reason why candidates tend to deprioritize behavioral interview preparation. When you're preparing for a coding interview, you put the code in the computer, it tells you if the answer is right. There's no place where you can just put the answer in and understand if your behavioral interview response is correct, right? There's not even a correct answer, right? What is a correct answer? It's difficult to define. So there's multiple layers of feedback that I recommend candidates go through when they're preparing. So if you are following the process that I outlined in the book and you've identified your core stories and your additional stories and you've built some Carl versions, some context action result learnings versions of these stories, then you have something that you can get some feedback from an LLM. And I think that's a great way to do it. Ask the questions of the LLM about, is this enough context? Is there too much? What kind of actions could I include that I've missed out on? Are these learnings short enough or tight enough? You can ask a lot of these kinds of questions of an AI, and it can give you some pretty good responses, and you can help to refine what you want to say. But we're not delivering these responses over email or in a document, right? Just because you write them down doesn't mean that you are ready to deliver them. So you need to practice delivering them. And as awkward as it is, I recommend that you practice with a video camera. So put the video camera on and record yourself delivering these stories. I think that will go a long way to helping you feel confident in the interview itself. And then when you listen back to it, you'll say like, oh, this is kind of boring. Or like, oh, wow, it's been a long time since I have shared an action in this part of the story. Maybe I should change that part of the story and deliver more of the actions that I've said. But ultimately, preparing by yourself is not the same as preparing with people. And what does Han Solo say? Like, good against remotes is one thing, good against the living is something else. So when you go and do some kind of mock interview, this can be a really great experience for you to practice. And you can start with a peer. So start with a friend or start with another engineer that you're preparing with. Even a spouse. It doesn't have to be a technical person. Give them a list of questions, and I provide some questions in the book that you can, some scripts that you can give to your peer. They ask these questions, and then you can practice delivering them. I still recommend getting a professional mock. So I think doing at least one, especially if you're applying for a FANG job and you want to get an interviewer who works at that FANG to give you a mock interview. And what this does is this helps you calibrate on whether your stories are really hitting the scope for the target level. Let's say you're applying for a mid-level engineer role. Am I telling the stories which would make an interviewer say, yes, this person is a mid-level engineer? And then it gets you those cultural signals. I talked about the structural approach to evaluating candidates, and then there's intuitive, that cultural fit. And do you say things in ways that match the culture of this company? And a professional mock interviewer is a great way to get that sense. You can think about, if you've had a recent behavioral interview, maybe you've had one recently and you're wondering, well, how can I improve? You can think about the kinds of follow-up questions that you received. So again, going back to what I said earlier about follow-up questions can be clarifying ones, and maybe you should include some of those details in your initial story response. They might be pointed ones, right? And maybe you should be defensive and proactive in defending against some of the follow-up questions that you got. If the person seemed disconnected and distracted, maybe that's telling you that the stories are not engaging enough or they're too long, right? So you can use those kinds of signals to incorporate into your future behavioral interviews. A little challenging to do by just watching the other person and seeing how they respond, but it is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the idea of doing it to video. It feels awkward, but years ago when I did my first business, we bought an early camcorder and we drilled the presentations for the business over and over again. 10-minute presentation, did it to the camcorder, recorded it, watched it, made notes, iterated on the presentation. And it builds up that confidence, doesn't it? By that repetition, by being able to see yourself, evaluate it. You get a bit more used to hearing yourself deliver it. You realize, as you say, what the delivery is good and when it's slow and when the story's boring, and maybe you start speaking too quietly, or maybe you get too quick at a certain point. And you can be your own worst critic in that aspect, but also if you really focus on how do I improve, how do I get a bit better each time I do it, it's very, very useful.
Yeah, it's like anything else. The more you do it, the better you get at it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about at different career stages? We talked a little bit about junior. We talked a little bit about your more senior. What would be the kind of 3 or 4 demarcations that you say that things change at? And what would be the things that we change?
I think you mentioned them. So there's junior engineers. That's like 0 to 3 years of sort of experience. There's senior engineer or close to senior engineer. And that would include both the title of senior engineer, but also staff. And then maybe even principal, although I think principal is probably in this third category, which is a leadership role. So in a leadership role, there's a lot more people responsibility. There's a lot more influence. There's a lot more impact across the organization. In fact, those interview roles tend to have very different kinds of loop structures. Like they will have additional behavioral rounds, for example, like in an engineering manager interview, there's 2 or maybe even 3 behavioral interview rounds, not just one. And likewise for very senior, like principal or distinguished engineer roles, they will have different focuses of each one of those behavioral interviews when they're asking you. So I think if you're in one of these buckets, like let's think about how we can help each of these engineers best prepare, right? If you're a junior engineer, your stories can be smaller in scope. And this is one of the biggest things I get in my coaching clients is that people think their stories aren't very good. They think their stories don't demonstrate the kinds of skills and the kinds of actions that companies look for, especially if a junior engineer is applying to a big company, right? A lot of imposter syndrome there. So what I tell them is managers are looking for engineers who can take a business problem and then add technology to it to produce business outcomes. You've probably done that. Your stories probably demonstrate an understanding and completion of the entire software development lifecycle. So tell them the story like that. That's what they want to hear. They want to hear that you collected the requirements and you understood them and you clarified them and you built a plan and you communicated the plan and then you implemented it and you debugged and you shipped, right? And that's a great story, right? That demonstrates your ability to work the software development lifecycle at that level. Tell that story, right? If you're a senior engineer, I think the bar is now shifting, right? It's moving away just from implementation, but now we need to see organizational impact and technical leadership. So scope really matters for these kinds of interviews. Even if the story about conflict is a really great one, but it's a conflict between just you and another engineer about something that wasn't a big deal, even if it demonstrated a lot of great actions, that's not the best story to choose. Earlier, I talked about how you choose stories, and scope is the number one thing. So you need to be choosing that conflict story that is about between you and maybe another organization, or like you and the skip level manager, something like that, right? Those larger scope conflicts are really important. And the stories that you tell, if at the end of the interview you've only told stories about implementing features or implementing very small projects, and you left out the story about the multi-year thing that you led end to end, that's not great, right? You want to be able to tell those large scope projects, right? And I think oftentimes for senior engineers, they leave out non-technical parts of the stories, and that's a mistake. So if you're a senior engineer or a staff engineer and you've been working on a project, yes, it has deep technical parts. You should tell those parts of the story, but also tell me about the alignment problem. Also tell me about how you communicated up to keep the executives informed about what was happening on this project, or how you convinced the other team to give you something on their roadmap that you needed for your project. So those kinds of non-technical aspects of projects become really important at that senior level. Now, if you're in this leadership bucket, you're an engineering manager, maybe you're a very senior IC like principal or distinguished, then of course the signal areas that we've talked about start to get weighted differently. So here, as a people manager, now I'm looking for things like, how do you coach people, right? Are you influencing others, right? Do you create an environment around you that makes other engineers successful? Can you set direction? Can you make build versus buy decisions, right? Can you prioritize across competing needs, right? I think that most of the challenge with very senior leaders or with engineering managers is that they provide too much context. So as a leader, oftentimes you spend a lot of time talking, and so you're like, oh, this is a talking interview. I'm going to talk. And that's not great. So I think you need to think about what is the most important context, because I'm assessing you on communication. If I bring you into my organization, will you communicate in an efficient and effective way when you're engaging with your team or when you're engaging with executives? And the interview is how I'm assessing you on that. So I need to that you can get to the point. What is the context that I need to understand the story, and then what are the actions? And of course, in that senior level and leadership roles, you have to be a lot more defensive in what you say. So for example, if you're telling a story about a time when you were handling an underperformer, one of the things the interviewer is going to look for is, how did you detect this underperformance, and did you wait too long? And a lot of us wait too long to handle underperformance. It's very common. And so then if that's the case, they will find that out. And so the question is, what do you do about that? So you need to be a little defensive and think about how you can set up the context in a way which even if it's a mistake that you waited that long, it's a reasonable mistake to make. So those kinds of thinking defensively is what I call it, is really important for those leadership roles.
So we talked about different levels there. You've also mentioned in the book that this varies by organization, and even maybe less so at some of the big tech, because you put a lot of effort into your hiring process and probably more of a scientific approach than a lot of companies have. But how does it vary when we're dealing with different companies? So a big tech versus a startup, or big tech versus a traditional bank, a more enterprise environment.
Right. So I think there's differences in which stories I want to tell, and there's differences in how I tell the stories and what language I use for these different organizations. Certainly for a startup, they are caring about versatility, right? They are caring about speed. They are caring about comfort with ambiguity, comfort with chaos, right? That's how their environment is. And so if you tell stories about how you worked the process, and you found the standard operating procedure and you executed it, I think that's not a great story for a startup. Even if that demonstrated great skills of yours, that's not a great story to choose. Or how you tell the story needs to be more focused on, for example, moving fast, or focusing on what the business outcome is, right? Or why that all this stuff was needed. So those understanding what kind of company it is really important. So if it's a traditional company, maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they do value stability and process. Maybe they value risk management, right? That's really important for a bank to ensure that the code is correct. Maybe more so than the AI camera filter company that you applied for last week. And so the stories that you choose and how you frame the stories need to be more focused on how you ensured that you were delivering high value product, and how you aligned the organization, because there's lots of layers in those kinds of companies, right? And how you ensured that you got the resources that you need. If you're applying for like a big tech company, so it's a large company, but it's very focused on technology, then you need to understand that they are not very hierarchical, and they are ones where they value individual ownership and individual initiative, even though you're working in a large organization. And they also value scrappiness and pace. So typically a company like Meta or Amazon or Google, you are having multiple projects at once, and you're having to prioritize that yourself. And there's a lot more independence and ownership that you have as an engineer. And one of the things that I bring in the book, because it's sometimes hard to describe exactly how to change your responses to fit one of these big companies, is I like to talk about different myths or different ideas that especially Silicon Valley has about themselves. And I use the word myths on purpose because it's not really true. But myths like, oh yeah, everything starts in a garage, right? This is the mythical story, like Hewlett Packard,
Yeah, I like that bit.
Steve Jobs, or all these people who start their company out of Jeff Bezos, right? He explicitly found a house in Seattle that had a garage, so he could say that he started his company in a garage. And what does that mean to them, right? That means that you can do more with less. That means that you don't wait for large edifices of organizations to be established. That means that you can do things with whatever resources you have, and you're creative and you solve problems yourself. Another one is really common is this sort of change the world. I mentioned Steve Jobs earlier. So these big companies, they really think that, whether it's true or not, they think that they are changing the world. They are making this huge impact on what's happening around them. And so when you frame stories, you need to frame those stories as, what is the bigger picture? What is the big takeaway? What is the so what? Why were you doing this thing? Even if the scale was less, because oftentimes we're coming from a smaller company going to a bigger company. You may not have billions of users that you impacted. But if you can say, wow, we really created this product that totally changed how the users would experience, their life, right? That kind of framing really matters to those kinds of companies. So I talk about that in the book and give some examples of how you can change language from sort of more traditional company into like more of a FANG company.
Yeah, and I think the impact, we should not forget that it's not always just about scale. I've worked at one company where I think the company had 2 customers, but those 2 customers were 2 of the biggest mobile phone manufacturers in the world. So you have 2 customers, but what you build goes into nearly 70% of mobile phones that are used worldwide. So you are having massive scale, but it's just via 2 customers.
Right. And I think that you can go even farther than that. So I think if you are working at even a very small company, maybe you have 2 customers, 10 customers, but they aren't like big mobile phone companies. How do you showcase that kind of impact? And the way that you do it is by talking to me about what impact it did make for those customers, and you showcase about why it was so important for them. And what that demonstrates is that you're thinking about how to make an impact with what you have. And that's the signal they're looking for, right? Everyone was new to big tech at some point. And so the signal they're looking for is not, have you impacted billions of people in the past, but how would you impact billions of people? And the way that you demonstrate that is by thinking about how you have impacted the customers you have built for in the past.
Let's pull that a little bit. Going back to the junior developers. The junior developers in today's market are struggling. Maybe have got no commercial experience. Could they talk about a side project they've done? Could they talk about something they've done that's maybe not professional software development?
Always default to a work story. So if you have a work story which is about software development, that is better than a personal project. That is better than a project from school. However, If you are a new grad and those are the only stories that you have, then yes, certainly. I think those are the kinds of stories that the interviewer is expecting from a new grad. It's stories from school, stories from side projects. And so I would come back to where we talked about earlier. What are the most important part of choosing a story? It's about scope. So the larger scope project, personal or school, that you've completed, those are the ones that you should tell. You should not be afraid of that. I think the companies who are hiring new grads are hiring for potential, right? They're not hiring for immediate impact. And so when you tell a story, make sure that you demonstrate things like strong learning, like, oh, I had to learn how to do this, and this is what I did in order to learn to do that, because that's what you're going to be doing on this job. You're going to be doing a lot of learning. Or your creativity, so how you approach the problem and solve that problem in some unique way, that's going to be applicable to that company. How you persevered through challenges, right? Every new grad is going to experience a lot of challenges when they come into any organization, and the manager wants to understand how you handle that. So make sure you showcase those parts of the personal projects or parts of the school projects that you are talking about that demonstrate those signal areas that we talked about.
So we've talked for about an hour and a half now, Austen. What are the real, the 3 or 4 top takeaways that somebody should have from reading this book?
Yeah, the first thing I really want you to take away is that your stories are probably better than you think they are. They have a lot of really great nuggets about how you built things, how you made a difference in the world, how you impacted customers, how you use technology to solve business problems. So I really want you to take that away if you're listening to this. Like, please, your stories are probably better than you think they are. Go back, think about those repeatable actions that you demonstrated in each one, and make sure that you're telling those repeatable actions when you tell the stories, right? Actions are more important than outcomes. The second thing I would want you to understand is that you need to understand the question behind the question, which is a great reason to pick up something like my book, right? Where you can understand what is in the mind of a hiring manager. How did they evaluate me? What are they looking for? The book has a ton of examples of responses, and I think it's great for you to spend some time reading through those responses, understanding, what are we looking for when I'm asking these questions. And then the third thing I would say is make sure that you frame your conversation to target whatever company that you're applying for, whatever the cultural context is around that company. So if they're a big company, if they're a startup, if they're a big tech company, frame your answers in a way that makes sense to that audience. And the last thing I would say is preparation is key. This is not a place where you can just show up and think that you can talk about yourself. Like, oh yeah, it's an interview where I talk about me. I'll just go in and tell some stories, whatever comes to mind. I don't think that's a great idea. This is a high stakes interview. Spend some time preparing, and you'll do great.
Awesome. So here is the book. Where can people get it? Where can people follow you, Austen?
Right. So please find me on Amazon. I'm sure they'll put a link in the description. I also have a Substack that you can subscribe to. It's called Mastering Behavioral Interviews. I'm sure we'll put a link to that. And that's where you can find me.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you very much, Austen.
Yeah, it's great to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Coding Chats. If you did, please like and subscribe. And feel free to check out these other videos on a similar topic.